So how do you tell the story of someone like William Wallace? Do you tell the story of the battles? Do you tell the legend of the atrocities committed against him? Do you focus on the great victory that he won at Stirling Bridge? Or do you focus on his death and martyrdom at the hands of King Edward, and the way in which that inflamed a slow fire in the many, many different hearts of Scots, people living in Scotland, and formed them into a massive bonfire that became Scotland and medieval Scotland? A place that would choose Robert the Bruce to be a king to represent them and gain acknowledgement by the Pope that Scotland was a nation, just the same as any other in Europe. Maybe that's the place to start. The land called Scotland. Well, it had a king of Scots, and that king of Scots had declared peace with Scandinavia, which Scotland was part of, I suppose. The Hebrides, called the Southern Isles by Norway, became the Western Isles of Scotland. Shetland and Orkney, well, there was a negotiation and some rent arrears and things, but in general, the King of Scots had mainland Scotland, the lowlands, the highlands, and the islands from Man to Unst. The abbeys and the Cistercians in the south of the country had done a great job in turning wildernesses into prosperous, fertile lands. Sheep grazed on the hills, and wool flowed down from the hillsides almost as much as water, where it was woven into cloth that was sent across the sea to France. The Hanseatic Trading League that traded cod and other goods from northern Scandinavia down to Spain. It had ports. It was a prosperous time. But then King Alexander III, died. Fell off a horse on the way back to visit his new wife. There was a crisis. The Maid of Norway was brought from Norway. A young girl to be queen, to unite Scotland and to unite all the nobles. She died. The nobility, those who were given the care of Scotland, fought amongst each other about who should be, well, in charge, top dog. And to sort this out, they got someone to make a rule for them. They invited King Edward of England to come and decide amongst them. Well, half of them were related anyway. Unfortunately, King Edward decided that, well, a different way of being king would be a good idea. That being a king meant everyone was subject to you. Perhaps it's because of his Norman ancestry and William styling himself a conqueror. This disagreement, however, only became clearly visible when King Edward wanted war against France to continue holding the lands that his ancestors had held there. And King Balliol of Scotland didn't. He negotiated his own truce with France. After all, Scottish ports traded well with French ports. King Edward was furious. And in retaliation, and to just show that he was top dog and he was in charge and Scotland was subject to him, he destroyed Berwick. Not just the buildings. In fact, more than the buildings. He destroyed everything that lived in Berwick. It was an atrocity. It was going well over the top. This angered the Scots. No small amount. They fought back. And this is where Wallace comes into the picture. It's difficult to say exactly when or why, or even where he came from, other than that it was lowland Scotland, the old north of Britain. Maybe his name even comes from Wallace, which was the name that the English used to describe the Welsh, who would describe themselves as the Britons, who once had a kingdom that ran from Govan in the north to Penrith in the south, and dated itself and its chronology and its proud heritage right back to the Romans. Well, that's one possible origin for him, but why did he become a warrior? Well, perhaps he fought with Edward in the wars against the Welsh in what is known as Wales, to make it a principality rather than a kingdom. Perhaps there he learned how to work with men, how to work with armies, how to know the terrain and use the terrain well. Perhaps there he learned the hardship of war. Perhaps one of the representatives of English rule in southern Scotland killed Wallace's wife. Now, killing Wallace's wife would be enough to make him angry, and if then, being a big man, he took matters into his own hands, and saw it his right to take matters into his own hands, he would become an outlaw. Either way, the story of Wallace arrives because at the right time he stood up and he was noticed and he was counted, and he raised an army. Murray in the north raised another army, and the two armies converged on Stirling to face a threat from the English army that was coming from the south. When it was there, Wallace read the land well. He was in the north, the English army in the south, and if you look at the maps, the River Forth flows to Stirling from the east and the River Clyde from the west. And if you want to go north, you have to go through the bridge at Stirling. Wallace controlled the high ground. He had his army laid out in schiltrons. That's a wall of spears. To the south, the army of England, without King Edward in command, was formed up. And it was infantry and bows and heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry that should be able to sweep infantry to the side and scatter them. Have you ever seen a horse galloping? Have you ever seen how fast it can charge? Imagine that with armour on it. Imagine you have to stand against it. Wallace had trained his men, and he had some experience from fighting wars and battles before. They had long spears, pikes, and the wall wasn't just a solid wall of one point. It was 3 ranks, 4 ranks deep, with long spears at different angles to make an impenetrable barrier. But the landscape's the thing that really worked. Wallace waited until half the English army was across the bridge, and that's where he started to release his trap. The schiltrons could advance, the cavalry broke against the pits that had been dug, the spikes, and the schiltron, the spear wall, it held. Like a phalanx from ancient Greece, the cavalry were destroyed. And seeing that they weren't winning, people on the bridge panicked. You could walk 4 abreast on that bridge, but 4 people walking forwards trying to join the fight at the same time as 4 people are trying to get back out of the fight, put too many people on the bridge collapsed, and after that it was a mess of bog and men and horses, and the Scots wiped the field. It is said then that Wallace made a baldric for his sword scabbard out of the skin of the commander of the English army. Powerful legend. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it shows what people thought of the invaders. So the story of Stirling Bridge makes Wallace mighty, and after that he is chosen to be a defender of the realm. Not a king. Well, he was Sir William Wallace, but he wasn't a noble. He couldn't be a king. And also, the nobles hadn't stopped squabbling amongst themselves. They all still dreamed of being King of Scots, maybe in the same style as Edward was King of England. But Wallace guarded the realm until the English came back with King Edward this time. And Wallace led his armies out, and he had some support, and the nobles joined in too. They turned up to fight, some of them. Wallace followed the English army and tried to use the terrain again. There were less of him. He didn't have the heavy horse. He couldn't survive a pitched battle, so he waited. When armies march, they're like a plague of locusts, and they consume everything that there is in their path. And Wallace had been using that tactic in the hope that Edward's army, having eaten everything there was to eat, would start eating itself and have to leave and go back home. Unfortunately, that didn't work. Edward found out where he was, at Falkirk, and moved his army in, and there was no way Wallace could back out of it. The battle was engaged in, not the best of places to fight, and this time the Schiltron, the wall of spears, was rained on by a cloud of arrows, and that is something the Schiltron couldn't stand up against. Maybe cavalry could have saved the day, but Wallace didn't have the heavy cavalry, and what cavalry he did have left the field. That wasn't a good day for Scotland. Wallace escaped with his life, but, well. And after this, Wallace fought a few more campaigns, maybe went to France and sought help with the King of France, because after all, Scotland declaring peace with France was what had caused this problem in the first place. However, the Scottish nobles still held on to the idea of all being their own kings, and one of them, two of them, who knows, betrayed Wallace. Wallace was captured, he was taken down to London. King Edward tried him for treason. But Wallace had never sworn an oath of fealty to Edward. How could you break loyalty with somebody you'd never promised to be loyal to? All Wallace had promised to be loyal to was the people of Scotland. The memory of his wife. The expectations put on him by the people close to him. The ones he had a relationship with. Anyway, Edward killed him and chopped his body into bits and sent the bits all around the country he wanted to claim to show he had power over the bodies of the people living there. At least, that's what he wanted to show. Maybe by chopping the body up, instead of dividing Scotland and showing that it couldn't stand against him, maybe in doing that, Edward lit the fires that started a flame that drew all of Scotland into a bonfire that later on erupted and stood against Edward again. Maybe it was the injustice, or maybe it was the injustice combined with ambition. Maybe it's really hard to tell the difference between both of them, because both of them are passions. But either way, the story of Wallace inspired people to sing songs, inspired people to write poems, and maybe even inspired people to write the Declaration of Arbroath years later, when they chose another man, Robert the Bruce, to stand to represent them, and wrote a letter to the Pope to recognise the spiritual authority of Scotland to stand as a country, a nation, a union of people, against all who would oppress those people. And in that letter, they acknowledge that Robert the Bruce is chosen that day, but maybe another day they will choose someone else. Because the freedom to choose who they'll be ruled by, which measure they'll live up to, is one they claimed for themselves. And they claimed that no man would give it up, even at the cost of their own life. Which is the final part of the story of Wallace. Great man, big man, tall man, wielder of a sword. In ancient days, they would have called him a demigod, like Hercules, or Theseus, or Perseus. This being Christian times, instead he's remembered as a martyr. Somebody died witnessing something bigger than himself. Witnessing doesn't just mean seeing, it also means speaking, acting, showing what you believe in. And maybe you're a Scot and this story is particularly true to you. Maybe you're a man of another nation, or not a man at all. whoever you are, whatever you believe, however you choose to identify yourself, remember this: you can make heroes. So, there's the story of William Wallace, or at least the bits of it that I've told today. Stories are bigger than me, stories are bigger than you. But people will tell a story of you, even if it's just your brother or sister. What sort of story are they going to tell of you? What are they going to remember you for? Are they going to remember you as a tyrant? Are they going to remember you as a freedom fighter? Are they going to remember you as the person who looks after them when they're in trouble? Whatever you choose, you've got a chance to make it happen. Because I'm the William Wallace. The story was requested by Jem and Kieran. I hope you enjoyed the telling. Please forgive the inaccuracies and take from it the good parts. And if you want to understand the difference between the two of them, there's someone really close to you who knows far more about it than I do.